Hello, very beautiful community. If this thing is working, then you can hear me. And if you can hear me, that you can see that I'm very unusually on the road. I'll tell you next time where I am, actually, because it's interesting. And what we're gonna do today is talk about the Western perspective on Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk Oblast. And I think I want to say three things about it. One, historical and geopolitical. A second, something about a micro tendency in Western polities right now to do with Ukraine. And thirdly, about Ukraine's security guarantees by the West after the war. So let's talk about this one by one. Now, you know that trillions of YouTubers are getting bazillions of views on the platform with arrows pointing out Ukraine's progress. I am not cheering. And I'm not cheering for a very important historical reason. There is no chance in hell Ukraine's invading Russia if Ukraine is properly supported by a West that combines commitment, a clarity of vision and strategy, and is able to put all of these things on the table because it has the democratic capacity to do so. That's absent, the democratic capacity. The strategy is absent. The clarity of vision is absent. The commitment is partly there. If all of that is in place, Ukraine's not interested in Russian territory. It's not going to be invading the Kursk Oblast. So, on the one hand, you are cheering for every picture you are seeing. On the other hand, every picture you are seeing is a manifestation of the West's withdrawal and strategic absence. And if you look at every possible political motivation for Ukraine here, right, putting aside military stuff, for which you must listen to others. Anders Bak-Nielsen here on YouTube, Michael Kaufman off the platform, many, many wonderful people are gonna give you that expertise, which I can't. But if you look at the political dimension of what Ukraine may be trying to do, and that might be mobilize folks a bit at home who are stuck between a story about the war that looks unrealizable and a story about the war that hasn't yet formed, right? What is victory if it's not full territorial reacquisition? It's a hard question for Ukraine. Ukraine's got a manpower crisis. This could mobilize folks at home a bit. This could refresh the West, right? This could not just refresh the West by demonstrating Ukraine's capacity and Ukraine's capacity to surprise, but also demonstrating Ukraine's capacity to show the West that some of the West's feared red lines aren't there. Now, it never follows from the fact that you've crossed 17 red lines that there are no red lines. That's a separate conversation. But nevertheless, I mean, this is clearly a demonstration to the West of the fact that its sort of early ideas about how not to escalate against Russia were too nervous. Now, but all of these political reasons for this move by Ukraine are against the background of the fact that the war looks like it may need to culminate in a place that is difficult and unsettling for Ukraine. And Ukraine is keen not just to put itself in a better position in time for that, but to shake things up before that happens in case favorable surprises arise. So Ukraine's own political motivations, right, for invading are not a product of things going smoothly. They're a product of being semi-supported and semi-abandoned by the West. So that's my first point, right? You don't get a Ukrainian invasion of Russia if you have strategic capacity in the West. Number two, there is a tendency in the West to try to see how you can bring a stop to the conflict. But there is no clear idea of how exactly you get that done. There's just a generalization we can fairly make about Western centers of power, that the tendency is we've got to bring this thing to a stop. But how? Because it's not sustainable to bring it to a stop in a way that leaves Ukraine unprotected from another invasion, or leaves Ukraine having sacrificed so much territory that it isn't clear that it's left as a politically and economically viable entity. On the other side, there are the Russians who also don't naturally want to negotiate. They either don't want negotiations, or they want negotiations and maybe even cessation of the conflict as a way of winning the conflict later on. So there's a tendency to want to put the war to a stop, but the realization that not everything is adding up to make that possible. And I've said that several times already. So let me sort of align that observation against the differences between a Harris-Walz administration and a Trump-Vance administration. Trump is flailing. He is also struggling to control his own neurodiversity in a counterproductive way. And Kamala Harris is surging. That will not necessarily stay the case, but we have moved from a situation where both could win and where it's now close. We moved from a situation, a few months ago where Trump looked like he was just set for victory, and now he's really close to a coin toss. And if he continues flailing and Kamala continues surging, Trump will become the underdog, having been a prohibitive favorite, then just a favorite for the past few weeks, and so on. But nevertheless, still, it can go either way. And so what's the difference in terms of this tendency to want to bring the war to a stop, but then an absence of a sense of how that might happen? The Harris administration is much more likely to take Ukraine's long-term needs seriously, is much more likely to be dialogical and consultative, and is much more likely to multilaterally engage with the European powers. Trump is much more likely to want to bring the conflict to a stop unilaterally, and is much more likely to cook up a solution in isolation and then try to shove it onto historical reality, hoping historical reality accepts it. That, of course, means that a Trump solution, if he manages one, it has a greater risk of being a bad solution and a destructive solution and a sustainable solution than a Kamala Harris solution. Kamala Harris is much less likely to go for a solution that is not going to be sufficiently hopeful and stabilizing and sustainable for Ukraine. It'll be really difficult for Ukraine, but she'll be keen to make it the case that there's a workable future for Ukraine. Third point, red lines. Now, we've talked about red lines quite a bit, but let's put this in another light. And this may be another political aspiration of Ukraine in invading Russia. The West's concerns about the Kremlin's red lines, which is actually just a silly expression, have had to adjust over time, allowing for much less escalatory and much weaker reactions to steps the West taken than the West was worried about. So there's lots of nuclear threats that have come the West's way from Russia, but every time the West has escalated, Russia hasn't done much. That does not mean that the Kremlin has no red lines, and it certainly doesn't mean the Kremlin would not use nuclear weapons. A Putin whose survival in power is at risk would be interested in using nuclear weapons. Having said this, the fact that so many escalatory steps have been taken by the West, which the Kremlin cried about, and nothing has happened, and now Ukraine has invaded Russia and nothing has happened, makes it less difficult for the West to think about giving Ukraine security guarantees, and even might make it less difficult for the West to think about bringing Ukraine into NATO. So I do think that there is this potential psychologically disinhibiting effect that this incursion may have on how Western leaders think and worry about Russian escalation, which could make them more open to either giving Ukraine security guarantees or even thinking about bringing a split Ukraine, a part of a split Ukraine, into NATO. These are the 3 points I wanted to share. Lots of love for the moment. Talk soon.